economy. And I think we all agreed, there's a consensus that there is a momentum that has built across countries, both at national levels as well as at the regional level around, accelerating the circular economy. And we see evidence of that in many ways. We have national policy frameworks being developed, plastic policies, action plans, roadmaps, and in some cases, EPR work is also ongoing. We also see that, regional collaboration frameworks have been set up. We have the AU Circular Economy Action Plan. We have, even at the REX levels, we have the ECOWAS, common framework for plastic waste management. And this morning we heard that the EAC is developing one. And I know that the SADC is also working on the same. There is also, the harmonized regional RPE standard, which I think is a very important game changer in terms of, the plastic, particularly the packaging plastic pollution issues that we've talked about, mostly. And of course, there's the regional financing mechanisms, that have come up. We know that the Africa Development Bank has set up the Africa Circular Economy Facility, and there are a number of other such initiatives that are also coming up. So all in all, there is very good progress, and that momentum continues to exist. However, when you look at the amount of work, the amount of conversations, and the amount of things that are being done, we do not see those reflected in terms of the impact on the ground and what we would have expected by now. And I think mostly, in my point of view, based on the experience I have had working across many countries and regions on this issue, is the fact that institutional frameworks that should drive concrete action, has been very weak, unfortunately. You find that in most cases, there is poor development planning at governmental levels. Take the issue of plastic pollution, for instance. In many countries, because of the absence of municipal water supply, people have had to rely on sachet water, particularly in the West Africa region. And also even the reliance of plastic bottles in most cases in homes is essentially because safe drinking water is not available for municipal authorities. So that kind of failure contributes to the challenges that we have. There is also the absence of credible data. If you ask anyone today, how much plastics does Africa consume? There is absolutely no way you can get any data that is close to the reality that you can work with. The same for plastic pollution figures, the same for recycling figures, the same for collection figures. And in the absence of data, there is absolutely no way you can make a meaningful progress in terms of trying to deal with something you do not understand the size. Technical knowledge, I think, a lot has been said about that today. Most of our policymakers, unfortunately, are far behind in terms of the technical knowledge on what to do and how to be able to mainstream the circular policies and circular materials into the economy. And so the result of that has been that you have industries that are far more sophisticated being regulated, by authorities that are far behind them. And in most cases, these regulators depend on the industries that they're expected to regulate to support them in capacity building, to support them in policy development and all of that. And of course, the implication of that is that everyone will play to their interest, which is the reason you see that things like the EPR schemes that are supposed to be very easy to adopt have always been stalled across African countries. In some countries, it is taking 7 years, 8 years to develop EPR frameworks. And even when those schemes are developed, it is very difficult, to get them implemented. And of course, we can't talk too much about the regional trade barriers because those are things that we've talked about so much. And so in my perspective, I think there are three fundamentals, three imperatives that we think we need to resolve if we need to make progress. The first is, of course, the issue of strengthening institutional capacity, both at national and regional levels. We have to have regulators that understand the scope and the intensity of the problem, as well as have the technical skills to be able to develop the frameworks and then the capacity for enforcement. In the absence of this, I think anything that we're talking about, we can bring out as much policies as we like, as much action plans as we like, as much regulations as we like. If the capacity to implement and enforce is not there, then of course, we're not going to achieve anything. And I think the challenges around that, has been well spoken about. The second element is the fact that there is no end-use market that is developed enough to absorb a significant portion of the circular materials that we are talking about, developing. And so it's important for us to also focus around how do we create markets for most of the things that we are talking about. If you look at today, RPET is supposed to be a low barrier issue where countries are supposed to adopt that. But if you check around the 54 countries in Africa, perhaps only South Africa has, a mandatory EPR content requirement, for the packaging industry. For most other countries, there is absolutely no mandate around that. And so what you find is that continuous use of virgin materials by the packaging industry, which then compounds the problem. And now we have an RPET standard for the continent. And if people were to invest in the production of RPET on the continent, who is going to do the offtake? And so what you find is that for most of the producers in the continent already, the export market is their target. Meanwhile, the problem of plastic is being confounded because of the continued reliance on virgin in the absence of regulatory frameworks and enforcement to compel the use of recycled materials. The building industry is perhaps another important area where plastics can be offtaken. If you take a look at today's construction industry, there's a lot of wood that is being wasted. But we can replace that with wood plastic composites. Whether we're talking about roofing, we're talking about doors, we're talking about cabinets, we're talking about anything that you use in the house. There is opportunity for us to mainstream plastics into the building industry as well. And of course, being able to have products that can be commercialized would mean that standards are required for that. And so that's why standards development, we have a lot of talk around making bricks from plastics. While these things are ongoing, but they are all at very rudimentary level, and they can't compete with the conventional materials in the market. And so standardizing those products is very critical in order to build market confidence and be able to create the basis for their commercialization. And of course, promoting regional plastics recycling value chain, like I've talked about earlier, is very critical. Okay, not all countries have the capacity to recycle plastics, and not all countries will have the capacity to recycle plastics. Some of them, have very small, plastic volumes. Some of them, cannot sustain the need for a recycling industry. And so being able to create a recycling value chain will create an inclusive progress. Having a country that is capable of, recycling, being able to access feedstock from smaller countries that cannot recycle, and then making the recycled products available to those countries. That's how we can build inclusive progress on the continent. And so it's important for us to also look at that. And for us to build that, we then need to remove the barriers around the region that is hampering, that from coming to pass. I talked about the building industry before, and I think there is not enough time for us to reflect on that, but there is so much that can be done within the building industry versus mainstreaming plastic waste into it. Those who have heard me talk about this issue would never tire about hearing me talk about South Africa. And that is because I think that we have a model that is also, part of what they celebrate as global best practice. South Africa today has achieved, over 430 tons of recycling in 2013, in 2023. And I think in 2024, they are almost closing to 450,000 tons recycled annually. And recycled plastics constitutes about 22% of their annual plastic consumption. If you look at the chart here, you find that it is not just PET that is being recycled, it is actually across all polymers. And there has been significant progress across the years. So it's important for us to ask ourselves, what has South Africa gotten right to be able to attract, the kind of investment and recycling infrastructure that they've done, so that some countries are able to replicate that and make progress in terms of recycling. But I think also the reason why they've made so much progress is because recycled plastics has been mainstreamed across several sectors in the country. From the automobile industry in the country, using recycled plastics material, to the building industry, to the agriculture industry, and of course the packaging industry, the textile industry. There is a lot of industries that are able to offtake recycled plastics, and that is what creates the velocity for the level of recycling that we see available in the country. And I think it's something that we also need to ask. The important thing to note here is that in South Africa today, there are beverage packaging brands that are 100% made from recycled plastics. Some are different levels, 25%, 30%, 50%. And the beauty of this is that the industry was far ahead of regulation. Even before regulation came on, the industry took upon them the self-regulating responsibility to say, we will do what is right for the environment, we will do what is right for the future, we will do what is right for our business. And that is why the EPR project has been on in South Africa since 2004, even before there was a regulation around that. And I think there's a lot of things we can learn from that. But despite this modest progress, the South African government has been bullish around making progress around this. And that is indicated in the revised EPR regulations that came up, I think, in 2020 and 2024, making it mandatory for companies to have targets around recycling, around collection, but more importantly, around the reuse of plastics. And that, I believe, is going to create even greater velocity for the recycling industry in the country. And so the result of this is that there is a steady growth in the sustainable jobs that are being supported in the recycling industry. Today, the recycling industry in South Africa employs almost 100,000 people, both formal jobs and informal jobs within the recycling value chain. And I think this is one of the things that we are all looking to see happen in our countries. So I think that there is a model for success. And I believe that the essence of regional cooperation is for countries to learn from one another, for there to be some kind of peer support mechanism where a country can find out what is South Africa doing to be able to get to this level of progress. And I think it's important for us to perhaps develop a regional case study that breaks down the challenges and the opportunities and how South Africa has been able to overcome it to achieve the level of success they have achieved. So this is my last slide, and I think that the conversation will take place more in the deep dive session that we'll have after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clem. And it was interesting to see the very detailed research on what is done in the plastic space. So next is ITU. Yes, Mulolo.
There's a slide in my presentation that basically my colleague just presented. That speaks to the challenges that are sort of applicable in the electronic sector as well. So I will not belabor that, and I think Hilda in the morning also touched on it. So ITU is a specialized UN agency on ICTs. So all the electronic devices, communication, we support countries, for example, to provide a spectrum and all that related for you to communicate right now with your families back home. And therefore, why our interest in electronics. Next slide. So we are the oldest among UN institutions, and we have 194 member states. So our mandate comes from those two resolutions in terms of how we find ourselves involved in electronics and e-waste management. There's a Kigali resolution and the Bucharest revised resolution as well. This just gives you a picture of what we've been up to, projects that are ongoing and those that are still on. For example, we've had support to Botswana to help them with the policy, Kenya and Niger. We have got work in Gambia, but also working in other continents. And I will talk about our project in Rwanda there and part of it in Zambia as well. This is the slide that has been shown even this morning, and my colleague also talked to it. about opportunities, and we've talked so much about policy framework. The CE landscape requires sound policy framework, institutions working together, and those things I will demonstrate. The absence of data, having a labor market. My colleagues talked about the market being available, so I'll show that. Now, our approach, this is very important because in a number of countries what we've found is that government colleagues quickly run to developing the legislation. We have a law on EPR or a law on e-West, and we leave it there. And the problem is that you're going to have a law, well and good, but if the administrative system, the capacity that my colleague talked about, whether in private or government is not available, then you have a problem. The other important leg in the tripod is the financing mechanism. For example, the law needs to understand how much does it cost to treat electronic equipment in the country, and how much do you have in the first place. So I'll show that in the Rwanda case on how we went about doing that. So we've sort of adopted a very collaborative role, and I've seen colleagues, for example, from Seychelles, where we were last year to look at opportunities for us to support them with a roadmap, and the different other countries that we've worked with. So our work in Rwanda started in 2001, and we worked with UNEP, GIZ, CST, and DSS Plus, which is a consulting agency, and different institutions in Rwanda, the government agencies. RICA RURA is the ICT regulator, so the e-West regulations in Rwanda sit with the ICT regulator, not with environment, as you find in other countries. So again, that is a country-specific scenario that you need to work with. The RICA is sort of the Consumer Protection Authority that looks at consumer products, and REMA is the environmental agency, and PSF is the private sector federation, so bringing government and private sector together. So one of the important things that we needed to address, because electronics will sit in the ICT department, but also relates to environment, but also to consumer, was to harmonize the different legislation that sits. For example, the ICT regulator would give licenses for e-West management, but when it comes to disposal, somebody has to go to the environmental agency. So one of the tasks that we needed to do was to look at the different legal instruments, not necessarily move them, but harmonize them and make the different institutions understand. Another important aspect that we did was a study on financing. If you have to create or develop an EPR system in a country, for example, in electronics, how then would industry or producers understand or determine what the EPR fee would be? So you need to understand how much it costs, transport cost, treatment cost, and the other administrative costs related to e-West treatment. So we commissioned a study as ITU to understand the situation in the country, how much is access to West cost, which is basically how much is a consumer willing to receive, to part away with their devices. If I told you I'm going to give you $100 or $200, at what point are you going to give me your old device? So that's the access to West cost, and that determines when you're doing the calculation of the EPR fee. So that is very important. And looking ahead for countries, like I said, you don't just want to develop a regulation on EPR and you leave it there as government without understanding the science and the financing involved behind that. The other part that we did also, working with the private sector federation, which the work continues, and the bank is also, Elisa is here, they're doing a pilot, was to build capacity in the private sector. It's very easy just to do a law and then the private sector is not ready to implement that law. So part of the package of the project that ITU has been involved is to build capacity in the private sector, the would-be PRO, to see the capacity within the institution, but also what tools and templates would they need. For example, a simple thing like they would need a contract to sign with the producer. If they do not know how to design a contract, they will have to contract a lawyer to develop that. So we support them to develop a template for reporting, for contracting producers, and for different things. So it's those kind of granular details that you need to look at. And like I said, the bank is assisting now to come in to see how they can pilot what we sort of engage. And like I talk about the governance of the PRO and the different aspects. So this table just gives you sort of the way the system moves. We talked about information management, for example. So in Rwanda, the Ministry of Infrastructure is responsible for data management. So every government institutions, whatever information that you generate, it has to find itself with the Ministry of Infrastructure. So in terms of mapping the system, we needed to include them in terms of when, for example, a business operator, you register, you want to get involved in, you register a license or a company for electronics. So immediately you do your business registration as a company, your data is automatically find itself with the different institutions, and in particular, the PSF, which is the PRO, would then know that James has registered a company as a PRO, so we look forward to him trading in electronics. So already PSF would get a text message that would onboard me to say, you are now eligible for EPR provision, and then you need to submit information that would then help the PRO determine what my EPR fee is. But also at the same time, for example, if you're dealing with refrigeration equipment, ODS, the environmental authority, which is REMA, would get information at the same time that you need different licenses. And then RRA, which is the customs, as products are coming into the country, they will be alerted and they will have access to that information as well. So, and then, like I said, Ministry of Infrastructure would then receive the data and also assist. The auditing of the process of the system is something that the conversation is ongoing, because you need an institution to audit the EPR system itself and see whether the EPR fees is being calculated fairly and there's level playing field. So we have different partners here. Like I said, GIZ, for example, was assisting us with digitizing the system. In Rwanda, they have a platform called Irembo. And so all the government transactions or services are provided for that. So we needed to find a way of having this onboarded on the platform, so that we don't create another system or another process for registration, licensing, and that would sort of harm the private sector in terms of the cost of doing business. So that also was incorporated in that process. So the work that has been done, like I keep on repeating, revising the legislation, capacitating the PRO, which is PSF, and like I said, ADB is assisting with the pilot on this aspect as well, coming in. The other aspect that we did was to publish EPR implementation guidelines. So this is a document that then sort of gives a simple understanding to a user of the EPR system, the legislation, and both as well as the processes of how to go about it. So this is a document that sits with government, but that helps practitioners understand the day-to-day steps of, for example, if I want to get into business of electronics in Rwanda, what's my first step? What documentation do I need? Which authorities? What are the sanctions? Or how do I do ABC? Yeah. And then other than that, also we did a branding in terms of awareness raising. So we've documented the whole process, having media on board to document the whole process, and having TV, radio programs just to assist with that as well. So part of the work that is still ongoing is to ensure that all producers are onboarded. So we identify all the different producers and bring them on board, because what you don't want to do in an EPR system is have free riders, people that go undetected, they trade on the market, but they don't comply to the system. So it involved, like I said again, it involves working with customs, because customs has all the databases of everybody that trades in whatever product. So there's been conversation about signing a memorandum of understanding between the Producer Responsibility Organization and the Customs Agency. And that way they are then able to release data to the PRO, and that helps them to identify all the producers and develop, like I said, an onboarding package and all the other information. Number 4 is very important, because what happened in Rwanda was that the private sector federation was designated to be the PRO, so there was no need to create a different institution altogether. But it was to understand that the already private sector institution would serve as a PRO, and that then helps to reduce the administrative costs and everything related to setting up a PRO. So that's something that you can think about, that you do not have to go and construct a new building, employ new people, and set up everything. But what institutions do you have already in the country that you can make use of? And all you need to do is to check the legal status of that institution. Do you need to change certain issues and see how they can work there? Quickly, in Zambia, it's more or less similar with Rwanda. It's in its infancy. There it's different. The e-Waste regulation sits with the Environmental Agency and not with the ICT agency, but we work with all of them. And Matthias is here. We've worked with the EU, and we are happy that now they've pushed the Africa the Switch to Circular Economy project that involves all these different countries, and they are moving forward as well. So this is sort of the work that's similar in Zambia, but different scenarios in terms of institutions and needs. And I think this has been discussed a number of times. So the legal framework is very important. My colleague talked about the market. So it's simple things. For example, back in the day, maybe 10, 15 years ago, most countries had legislation that banned the import of hazardous waste, and that includes electronic waste. So for example, if you want to set up a regional infrastructure for e-waste treatment, and your legislation doesn't allow the import of hazardous waste, you need then to generate enough materials for you to make a business sense, or to invite private sector participation. So it's those kind of things that impact one another, that as government sometimes we rush to create legislation, but which then doesn't help with the business. But also, emphasizing what my colleague says, it's important to realize also that it's not everybody that can have infrastructure, or that needs to have that kind of infrastructure. You can be the market for another country to then move and support the regional approach in doing things. Thank you very much. I'll end here.